Okay, so here we're going to be learning how to make just a simple computer and an error message, or you could call it an alert or a notification, whatever you want to do. And yet again, we're working with very simple shapes to make unique and complex things, combining them with color to kind of give us a really clean, kind of realistic look. Now, granted, it's just flat design, so it's meant to be, not high res, low res, but we're looking for something realistic. Yeah. So here we have our error message, and it's just an open lock with a passage, and then we have our computer. So I'm going to show you how I built these, and then we're going to build them together. We're going to start off with our error message. Shrink this guy down, throw him over there. And believe it or not, he's actually a little bit more complicated than the computer, and you're going to kind of see real fast what I'm talking about. So the error message, the text itself is pretty simple. It's just a white rounded corner square and a bunch of gray lines. So nothing too crazy there. And all I did to line those up was I made for myself a little guide. Bam, there's your guide, and then I measured them out. And we're going to do that here in a second. The lock is a rounded square and a circle for the keyhole. The shield shape from our shapes for the lock part. And then here, this is kind of goofy. This is actually three things, and you can't see them right now because this rounded square is in the way. So we'll talk about him real quick. This is the error message itself. It's just a big rounded square. And then I used a triangle to be the little arrow pointer thing at the bottom. But how I made this weird little shape for the locking mechanism part, it is just a regular old rectangle, a circle, and another rectangle. And if you combine those together with your red rounded square, it gives the illusion that it's one solid kind of candy cane or upside down J shape. Let's back out, and we're going to go ahead and delete all this stuff so we don't need it. And let's talk about the PC. This could be an Apple monitor. This could be a Sony, Samsung, whoever. I just went with a very generic look for a monitor. So this isn't a complete front view flat design object. You can see we've added just a sliver of the side, and that's just to kind of give it some depth. So how we do that is you just take your main shapes, and let's see if I can get them out, and you just kind of make a copy and slap them back there with a lighter color. Or if this, the monitor itself is lighter, then you use a darker color. But if we get rid of that, you can see how much flatter it gets. And then down here, ooh, wrong one. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get it by itself. There we go. Nope, still didn't get it. Down here, we just made a copy of the shapes that were our base and threw them behind in a darker shade. And I'm going to rebuild this base real quick so you can get an idea what it looks like completely flat. And obviously that's not perfect because I had to disassemble it real quick. But you can see once we remove the side pieces, now it's kind of like a straight on shot. And depending on what you're going for, either one could look better. It all just kind of depends on what your total composition is going to be. I did a simple grayed out screen right here. If you wanted to take that and fill it in and do something other than just grayed out stuff. Where are we at? There we go. That's not perfect, but I'll make it perfect here in a minute. And let's say you want to do like white. And then let's make it kind of sort of look like a website. Oops. Make a copy, get another one, make it kind of sort of look like a website. Let's pretend this is a banner. And then we would need some, wrong one. Then we would need some text. And we're just going to pretend that this is a single format type of setup. Those of you guys who don't know a lot about web design, tons of different websites out there. Just a center format single column website is about as simple as you can get. And although this isn't perfect and doesn't look hyper realistic, you can kind of get the idea of what we're going for. So there you go. Let's pretend that that's your website. You could have done that. And obviously you can take this into significantly more detail. What I would do is, if you want to go this direction, I would actually pull up a website that you like, something that's got a lot of high contrast, a lot of good coloring. And I would ask myself, if I had to break this down to shapes, what would that look like? So let's get rid of all that. And bye-bye. Okay, so let's talk about how we grade out this monitor. It's just two shapes. It's a triangle that has a little bit of transparency, and then it's just a gray kind of rectangle. And we're going to go ahead and delete these guys. And then our monitor itself is just a rounded rectangle, nothing too crazy. And then here's where we use some coloring to kind of help us out. If you look at this right here, this is a slightly darker color, and that's denoting that the light source is coming from somewhere above, because if it was dead straight on light source, what would you not have? You wouldn't have that shadow there at all. This would just all be relatively one color, and then you wouldn't even have this either. It would just all be flat. Now, if you've ever been to an electronics store and, let's say the lighting's not super great, but it's that classic, fluorescent bulb, white out everything lighting, you've probably seen exactly what I'm describing. So let's go ahead and delete all this, and then we'll build it up from scratch. Okay, the first thing we're going to need is a triangle. And we're going to take this guy down. We're going to make him relatively small. We're just going to center him on the page. And we want him to be lighter. Maybe not quite that light. There we go. And then we need a rectangle. And we're going to make him really teeny tiny. And I made him a little too big. No big deal. Good deal. And then we're going to make him lighter. And then we're going to need a shading bit, because we're making this all the way. So what we're going to do to make the shading bit is we're going to center up on our old triangle. And then we're going to make this triangle smaller in a corresponding manner. And then we're going to give him some transparency, or drop the opacity, whatever you want to say there. And there we have our base. And once we get our rounded rectangle up, we'll play with it more. So most monitors are widescreens nowadays. So keep that in mind whenever you're making them. If you make it look like this, that's not realistic. I'm sure there are some monitors out there that are just unbelievably broad, but your standard computer monitor, not so much. By contrast, if you make it just a completely perfect square, unless you're in an office that's using really old Acer monitors or something like that, or ViewSonic monitors, most people have moved to the widescreen format. So I wouldn't use that either if you're trying to make your illustrations look trendy. So you don't have to sit there and measure and say, well, how do I get to a perfect 16:9 setup? Just kind of eyeball it and get in the ballpark. So we're going to make this guy black. And there we go. There we have our rough monitor. Now here's where, if you want this triangle to be a little bit different, to adjust, say, where the shadow was hitting, here's where you'd want to do that. And kind of decide for your illustration, where am I going to have my light source coming from? Now I think I made my shadow a little too big for me, so I'm going to drop him back down and recenter it. And I kind of like that. This kind of shows that the light source is coming from over here, and kind of sort of not necessarily straight down, but kind of like if you were standing looking at this, there would be a light above your head, probably about 10 or 12 feet in the air, shining at the monitor, and that would cast that little sliver of a shadow. So the next thing we want to do is we want to take our base, we want to make a copy, and this is where it's going to get a little wonky, a little difficult. You got to kind of line this guy up, and while we have him, you have to change all the colors. And now we're going to send him back. And bam, there you go. You have a 3D effect. Now, if you'll notice right off the bat, our effort over here to really kind of make that shadow continue didn't work out. So I'm going to pull him back. As opposed to doing that very dark gray, I'm going to go all black. And then I'm going to send him back. And that's a little bit better. It's not perfect, but it's okay. We can zoom in and we can play with it more. and let's just kind of find out what's going on. There we go. So pay attention to your layers, because I kind of screwed up there. I sent everything back, not paying attention to the timing that I was sending everything back, and the layer that I wanted was there, and probably that original dark the original dark gray color would have been fine, but because I wasn't paying attention to what layer was on the absolute bottom, you know, it was just hidden by this other layer. But nonetheless, that shows us what we're going for. And you can see we're starting to get that 3D effect. Now we're going to make a copy of this guy, and we're going to get him nice and center first, then we're going to pull him over. Then we're going to go for this light gray. We're going to send him back. And you can see I came way too far over. You want this bottom triangular shadow and this side kind of exposure to relatively feel similar. And if you wanted to, could you zoom all the way in? Well, hold on. Could you zoom all the way in, get a square, and measure exactly what that is? If you were trying to make this absolutely perfect, of course you could. This is going to be a lot of work to do it this way, but it would make it 100% accurate if that's something that you really need. I don't need that today, but since we're here, where's my little square? Oh, they're all down there. Zoom all the way in, and we'll level him out. And then we'll bring this guy in. And if you had to have it perfect, that's what perfect would look like. But yet again, you can see we're not talking about a really super huge difference there. So kind of going by eye or by hand would be more than acceptable. And last thing we need for this part is our screen. So we're just going to start off with gray. And we're going to just make it, kind of just eyeball fit it till it looks good. And that looks about right. Maybe we could have a little bit more on the vertical side, just like that. And now we're going to take our right triangle, we're going to stick them in the corner, and then we're going to size them. And for this, we're definitely going to zoom in, just because it's going to be too hard to tell with that gray on gray exactly where we're at. Even after we change it, it's going to be really hard to tell. And that may be a little too light. No, I think that looks pretty good. So now we're going to go ahead and zoom in. And I got lucky on this corner. It seems to be pretty darn close. We're going to fiddle with it just a little. And for those of you guys who are watching, the corner is down here, but my little slider thingy is up here. And we're going to go to the top corner. And I got pretty close here too. You know, I'm relatively pleased with how lucky I got. Oh, and I have lost it, so here we go. That's about as good as that's going to get. Okay, good deal. Let's back on out, and there we go. We have a PC or an Apple. I think that probably looks more like an Apple than it does like a PC monitor, but here nor there. So the next thing we need to do is we need to make our alert message. And we're going to get our rounded rectangle out. And we want this guy to look very rectangular-esque, mainly because, you know, whenever you think about a pop-up or an alert coming up, you know, they're usually not a perfect square. They're kind of a little bit more of a rectangular shape. And we're going to make them red. You can just go with the standard red. If you wanted to do it a different color, you're more than welcome to. Yet again, your imagination is kind of your limit on that. And let's go ahead and make our text section. In our text section, we're gonna make that more kind of like sideways or a straight up and down rectangle. Let's try and center them up, then we're gonna move them over. That looks pretty good. And then all we need to do here is go back to our shapes, get a square, thin it up real good. lighten it up by 50%. And place it in our little white area. And now we need to zoom in. And we're going to make a guide real quick. So all we do for a guide is just take a square, plant it right there, take another copy of our original, level it up, and repeat. And that's our guide, and that's how we keep everything looking, looking relatively even. We don't want your computer type to look like Comic Sans. And what I mean by that is just imagine if you had a line, I'll delete this real quick. Just, imagine if you had a line right here, and then your other line was down there, and they were all wobbly and wiggly. It just wouldn't look very professional. Now, if you were trying to make something reminiscent of a handwritten note, think about a handwritten note. It's all over the place, because everybody writes differently. Some people, they write as clean as machines. Other people like me, you have to try really hard to know what I've handwritten, so I don't do it very often. So just, keep that in mind. If it's on a computer, it's usually going to be very concise. If it's handwritten, for most people, it's going to be a little wobbly, and you could get away with spacing like this on a handwritten note, but on a computer, it's going to need to be pretty darn perfect. And then let's see how far we are away from our bottom. We're a little off. So what we're going to do is we're just going to kind of bring everything down a little bit. And measure again. I think we're going to be pretty close. And I'm not trying to make this necessarily perfect. I just want it to look as close to perfect within reason. And that I'm not worried about that little sliver of overlap there, so I'm just not even going to bother. And then we're going to back out. And there we go. We have the text portion of our error message. The next thing we need is our little triangle. So we're going to bring one up. We're going to flip them upside down. We're just going to line them up perfectly for right now. Grab some red, shrink them up a bit, and drop them. And that would be fine, technically. I'm sure you've all seen error messages or pop-ups that look like this. I like giving them kind of a little bit more of a comic book feel, where you have a little bit of that kind of twist in there. And we're going to throw them all the way to the back. And there we go. It kind of has that, I don't know what nobody described it other than say the comic book feel, where, you got the, the bubble or the circle or the whatever it is, and you have something pointing down to the character. I've always personally liked that, so it's in general in my style, but you can do whatever you want. If you want it to point straight down or whatever, that's whatever you'd like. Okay, now we need our kind of upside down or shieldy looking shape there. And we need to make him a gold. So we're going to start off with orange. And then we're going to come over to our color spectrum, and we're just going to search for something that looks kind of gold-esque. That looks pretty good. Not perfect, but pretty darn good for an error message. And, yet again, colors are completely subjective. If you don't like the color that I picked, which I think was hashtag DDA652, pick a different color. If you want to go with something more yellow-esque, and kind of go in that range, there's nothing stopping you. And maybe that looks better. So, for right now, we're going to go with that, and that would be hashtag or pound sign, DFC325 or 352. None of that really matters unless you're just trying to actively be hyper precise on some of your coloring. As long as it looks the part, it's going to look good. And then we need to shrink him down. Now here's where we're going to need to use a little bit of composition style work. The size of the lock has to be in balance with the size of our text area. So you got to think about where our J is going to come. You see where my cursor's at? It's going to be relatively proud over our entire locking mechanism part. So keep that in mind. Now with that said, if you get too small, people aren't going to be able to instantaneously tell, oh, hey, that's a lock. So just kind of play around with it and find something that feels right. And we're going to shoot for kind of like a half and half. That'll leave me plenty of room for the J and plenty of room for the locking mechanism. Now I'm going to pull up a circle. I'm going to make it very teeny tiny and black. And we are going to center him on the lock as best that we can. And then we need a rounded rectangle, and same deal. Thin them up real good, make them black. Ooh. It's the only thing that's a little irritating about Canva is when you start getting these shapes super small, they do get a little bit difficult to get a handle on. And we're actually going to zoom in to refine this, just because it's going to be a little hard for me all the way out there. I like that. I think that looks good. So now we need to do our locking mechanism. On this, you're going to have a little bit more creative freedom, mainly because, locking mechanisms come in different sizes. So, I'm going to do just the classic, skinny kind of J shape. You can do whatever you'd like if you want to do something more complicated than that. And there's all the pieces that I'll need. And we're going to go ahead and zoom in. And let's talk about the pieces that I have here to make this. We went over them earlier, but just to go over them again, I have a rectangle, which will serve as my shaft. I have the donut shape, or the circle with a hole cut out, that will serve as my crook or my hook portion. And then I have a square, which I'm going to use to mask. So let's go ahead and do that. Now you need the shaft portion and the hook portion to be roughly the same size. And that can be a little challenging to get everything lined up. Sometimes you get lucky, like what I did just right there, and it lines up perfectly and you got nothing to worry about. But use the zoom slider over here on Canva to your advantage, and make sure that all your little alignments look straight. And then I'm going to pull my square over here, and it really doesn't matter what size the square is. You just want it to be where it's going to cover up the bottom portion of the circle. Now here's something to keep in mind. If you move the square all the way up here, it's gonna not have a complete hook to the J part of the lock. If you move it too far down, it's gonna have too much of a hook. So just try and shoot for the dead center, because what you're trying to make it look like is, if somebody clacked it all the way down, it would function like a regular lock. And then we come back with red. Where did my square? Oh, there we go. Okay. All right, so there we are. There's our hook part. And then we're going to make this kind of a silvery color. And there we have our lock. So let's zoom out and let's take a look at it. Now, obviously that looks funny. So ask yourself, why does that look funny? Well, does that look like in any way, shape, or form that could ever even remotely lock? And the answer is no, it doesn't. So all we simply need to do is we need to make our locking mechanism a little bit bigger. And that's probably a little too big. Line it up again. We're going to send this back. And then if we still feel that it doesn't look right, we can actually pull the whole mechanism down. And to do that properly, we're going to need to zoom back in. I think we're getting pretty close. Let's go all the way into 300. And yeah, that looks about right. And what I'm doing here is I'm just moving it around with my arrow keys. I feel pretty good about that. So we're going to back it back out. And I'm not in love with the shape of my hole to lock ratio now, so we're going to zoom back in. And I'm going to make this guy a little bit bigger. And this is an excellent time to kind of cover, my philosophy on training and stuff like that. You're going to make mistakes, and it's perfectly okay. It doesn't matter how many mistakes you make, as long as it looks good in the end, who cares? And that looks about right. So there we have our error message. Let's go ahead and group this together. And yet again, if you wanted to play with this more or do the colors differently, or whatever your heart desires, this is your illustration, it's your drawing. You can do whatever you want to do with it. And let's go ahead and make the computer relatively decent size, and we'll take our error message and put them over here, and we'll go ahead and center them just for giggles. And there we go. There's a complete illustration. This is kind of like a front to front angle shot, and you could probably see this on a website or an infographic, or some type of media, like say like a Facebook post saying when's the last time you changed your password, whatever, something like that. Anyways, that's going to conclude this lesson. I will see you in the next one.